Welcome back to all our listeners on NRI Samay. This is your host Suresh. Recently, we have heard quite a bit about the Cambridge Analytica, a private entity which was in the news for all the wrong reasons. It had unauthorized and maybe even illegal access to tons of data pertaining to the Facebook profiles, I think to the tune of 60 million or more. And in the day and age where everything is data-driven, and data is also considered the new oil, this is extremely disturbing. While Cambridge Analytica is a private entity in India, however, the government is collecting somewhat of a similar data set and maybe even more through their UID or Aadhaar project. UID is Unique Identification Number. Now, whether it is equally as threatening or damaging as the Cambridge Analytica, or it has, really good intentions, we'll find out more about these details. And to talk about that, we have none other than Dr. Usha Ramanathan, who is an expert on law and poverty, and she's also represented in a lot of these kind of privacy issues and security issues, and she's actively writing on Aadhaar and the perils of Aadhaar on different perspectives, giving us different insights. So, Dr. Usha, thank you very much for joining with us.
Thank you, Suresh.
As I was saying in the beginning, does Aadhaar pose a similar threat as the Cambridge Analytica, or is it more or less, or we are unnecessarily concerned about Aadhaar because at the end of the day, as most of the middle class feel, it is a matter of convenience because instead of carrying 10 different IDs, we are only carrying one ID and we can just walk away with very less hassle.
Actually, I think the first thing we need to understand about the Aadhaar project is that you don't carry an ID.
Right.
The whole idea was that this is not any ID you have to carry, that when you carry yourself, which you invariably end up doing, your biometrics are what will determine that you are who you are. So that's going to be your method of identifying yourself. Of course, one thing to remember, so from the beginning, this UID was never called, it was not a card, and it was made plain to us that it was never intended to be a card. It is a number attached to a biometric. And all the documents, there are a series of documents starting from 2009 which show us that they did not know whether biometrics would work as an identity for people. They did not know whether biometrics change, whether they remain the same over time, what kind of changes would come in, would people not be able to identify themselves with the biometrics at all, or would there be some way of improving on a system. They knew none of this. So this whole thing, in fact, in 2010, early in 2010, there was a document where they are inviting a biometrics consultant to come in and work with them. And they say in that quite openly that we know nothing about whether it will work or not because demographic and environmental factors determine how and if biometrics will work. So they said it was all about having confidence that it will work. So that's the first thing, to remember that this is a number attached to a biometric. It was not something that you could carry on your person, which you could then flash out and show to people if you needed to use it. It depended upon whether biometrics would work and whether the technology would be able to receive biometrics, none of which was known. By now, we know that biometrics is really not the route to go because it's not working for a large number of people. It's not something that we are saying. It's something that the project itself has admitted as being a problem. So we've had massive numbers of exclusion. We've had people dying because they are unable to identify themselves through this. We've had the UIDAI chief speak to the court and admit that there are something like 6% and 8% of people who have tried using biometrics for it not at all working for them on fingerprints and iris. And for many others, it may work this time, it may not work the next. So I think the first thing to remember is that this is not about it being an identity system. It's not about having something which you can then use as your ID. And that's the first thing to remember.
Right. So then, okay, let's take this one step ahead. So let's say I'm catching a flight or traveling somewhere, and I give my, fingerprints, That's the way of, let's say buying a ticket or getting on board a flight. So what is the risk with that?
Actually, there are 2-3 risks. The first thing, of course, is about whether it can work at all or not. And like the UID AI chief said in court, and what we've been saying all along, the UID AI chief said that, well, biometrics may not work, but where it doesn't, we've told the authorities, who are the local authorities, to make sure that they do not deny people an entitlement because their biometrics has not worked. It's like an open admission that's been made that it may not work. It does not work. I mean, it's a huge problem for old people. It's a huge problem for young people. It's a huge problem for working class people, and for many others in between. So they've accepted that not only is it that it won't work for 6 to 8% at all, it's not working, but also that for each person it is uncertain. It may work this time, it may not work the next, depending upon how your biometrics, your fingerprint or your iris gets received. So that's one. And they keep telling us that they expect us to keep updating our biometrics when it stops working. So to think that this is some kind of grand way of identifying a person, and that there is no doubt once you've had the biometrics used, it's a new kind of mythology that's being created. So that's one. And the other, of course, has to do with what the project actually is. If biometrics is not the project, what is the project? The early on in 2010, they had a document which they called UID, a numbering project. This is about numbering people. It's about giving the uniqueness is not about biometrics, because you can't be sure of that, but it's about uniquely numbering each person so that they become identifiable across databases and across time. And just remember that once it starts becoming a numbering scheme and it's across, like I said, databases and time, you have no control over it at all. It's your information, but it's information that somebody else wants to converge in various ways, use in various ways, transact on in various ways. And the state has taken over the power entirely. In law we have a doctrine of eminent domain, which many of us know as being applicable to land. That the state has said, the doctrine says that if for a public purpose the land needs to be taken over by the government, by the state, then the state can take over private land for a public purpose on payment of compensation. This doctrine has over the years, over the decades, slowly, kind of reformed itself. And the state today in many parts of the world acts like it has right to all the land in its territory, and people can have it at their sufferance, at the sufferance of the state. Now the human body has become something like that, and information about us is becoming a resource which the state then says belongs to it, and it will dictate to us where we should put it, who can use it, what kind of uses it can be put to. So it's important, when we say privacy, it's important to remember that we are not just talking about the next door neighbor not knowing about us, things that we don't want them to know about us. It is about constructing our images through these various ways by which they are numbering us and putting us in various databases, and then recreating our images in various kinds of ways in which very often we may not be able to recognize ourselves.
Right. So then this is something even Google is doing these days, right? If I have my Gmail account and travel somewhere, or if I buy something, Google is keeping track of pretty much everything.
Correct.
So one may ask, why is it that I feel comfortable with using Gmail because it's so convenient for everything? Why am I so concerned with UID or giving my fingerprints?
I would actually say maybe you shouldn't be so comfortable with Google. It's not a great idea.
Right.
Because the fact is, in a recent interview that Fritjof Capra gave to Daryl De Monte, which was published in one of the Indian papers, he says two things which struck a chord with me anyway. One is, he said that the problem is that technology has begun to develop and grow and expand without an ethical basis. So the possibilities, and that's what he says, so I'm adding to that. I'm saying that the possibilities that technology seems to provide are sought to be exploited without worrying about an ethical basis for this. And the second thing that he says is that technology seems to be all about global capitalism. Now, these are things to worry about, because all these agencies are agencies which have gone way beyond anything we've seen before, and are today saying that they want to know everything about every individual, us as individuals, us as communities, us as societies, as states, and then to use it as they will. Now, one doesn't have to see a malevolent intent every time, but we can't be presuming a benevolent and an intent every time, right? Why would it be all right for some entity like this to know so much about us? Now, why is Google, in my mind, a different problem? It's not less of a problem, a different problem from having the state get acquisitive about our information. The reason is this. I look to states to help us control the power that Google is acquiring today. Now the states are imitating Google and trying to better it. And they are sharing that space with these technology companies. The Aadhaar project, which I will choose to call the UID project for various other reasons, and which is what the project is anyway, that project is a project that, it's very interesting how this project came to be. Because in the early days of this project, one of the early documents that was prepared was done by the person he was a chairperson of a committee that was set up soon while he was the chairperson. So it's called the Tag Up report. The Technology Advisory Group on Unique Projects produced a report. And they begin the report with saying that, we know that government has no ability to deal with data. They can't manage data. So the government should allow the setting up of private companies, they'll be private companies, but they will be called national information utilities. And whatever data the government has about all of us, any data, not just about us, about taxation, about money, about whatever, that information should be handed over to these national information utilities. In fact, it was done in the context of tax, 5 streams of revenue, saying that you give that to the private companies who will then service the state and then will go on to make whatever profits and from their other products and services they create. You think about what is being said here. What is being said is that the state has no ability to deal with data, privatize all that information. We give it to the state thinking it is a custodian of our information to be used only for a particular purpose. And now that information is being handed over to private companies. It's already been set up. Our goods and services tax network is the second, I think, perhaps of its kind, which is called a national information utility. And all our tax revenue is going, all our tax revenue, that is the goods and services tax revenue across the country, it's something like 2 to 5 billion vouchers are being generated every month. And this information is going to a private company that's been set up. And they are now allowed to use that information by creating their own algorithms and whatever. They can see where the distress is. They can see who is making profits. They can see what the, ups and downs, the troughs and sloughs of businesses are, of people, of areas. And then they use that information. Now, these are things that at best, in the public interest can be public information. They are becoming privatized information through the intervention of the state. Think about what that means.
Right. So it's almost like a wild, wild west where anybody is able to access this data and do anything with that. So are there no privacy laws protecting the citizen?
Actually, interestingly, it's not like the wild, wild west. It is a case where there is a complicity and a collaboration that has happened between private interest and the state. So what's happened is it's a very interesting phenomenon because people who companies who in their guise as companies are telling the state that they don't want laws which affect them, they don't want labor legislations especially, they want the state to back off completely. They are going back to the state to say, you back off from us, but you please get on to the case of the citizens of this country and force them to part with information which we can then use. This whole UID project is completely done through using coercive power that the state is exercising. It's not even legal power. It's just power that the state is able to exercise because it has the ability to coerce. So it's a fascinating kind of thing that's happening where the same people who are espousing a legal philosophy when it comes to a liberal philosophy when they say that the state should back off is saying back off from us but get on to the case of the citizens and collect all that information and give it to us. That's what this project is about.
Right.
And there is one additional thing, which is that, there's information and there's information. There's a lot of things that we need to know. The Right to Information Act said that when the state is doing something, the state should be both transparent and accountable. So we have a right to that information. This project very clearly says that all the information that there is about the individual should now be available to the state and to whoever they are willing to allow to access it. So when you say what is the problem with it being transparent, it's actually not even transparent. In fact, we don't even know the number of places where it is. We have no idea of what kind of uses it is being put to. But there are these companies that are, furthering that. We have 5 companies, for instance, which are in the Supreme Court today, which have gone there to say, please don't change the law, don't change the project in any way, because we have built our businesses on this project and we will not be able to carry on with our businesses. So that's the extent to which this has moved. And what's really interesting is that when we say information today, we are not talking about the world. We are not talking about learning our geography and geology. We are talking about companies that are wanting to build their whole businesses on personal information about people. I think it's time we sat up and noticed that.
Right.
Data protection today is not just about resource mapping. It is about people and their personal information as the resource.
Right.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just saying it's a different form of appropriation. And, because we've been lulled into not seeing the problem too easily, because we were brought into using these technologies before we even noticed what was happening. So everybody's become dependent on the mobile phone. And, when I look around me, I actually don't have a mobile phone myself. And I know how I feel differently from how another person feels, because there is this sense, oh my God, if this mobile phone can actually be tracked like this and so much information gathered through it and so much control over me be exercised, oh my God, but then how do I do without a mobile phone? No? So you've already got hooked on before you know that this is the kind of technology that you've been introduced to.
Right.
On
the other side, we do have individuals who, let's say, if I lose a phone or if somebody stole my money from the bank, I know that it belongs to me, and I can, pursue legal ways to either get back what I lost or pay for to compensate me for the loss, or so on and so forth. But data itself is not viewed as property that an individual owns.
Right.
And so how do you sort of bridge that gap that we are currently seeing? Because without us realizing that this is our personal, we have stakes, we have ownership, how do you sort of go about bridging that gap?
No, actually, I think the one distinction that we continue to make, I continue to make that, and so do many other people, who I work with, is that data, personal information is we never want it to be property. It's not transactable. It's not something that you pay for and take away. And once you've taken away, you have ownership rights of various kinds. We don't accept that at all. So for us, personal information is really about rights. It's not about property. It is about the rights that I have to what information will be given to whom. For instance, today when, there are companies that can say that I'm not going to give you your service unless you give me your UID number. And once you get the UID number, because it's put in multiple databases, then they can use that multiple databases to create a profile about you and then decide whatever it is that they want to do with it, because there are many businesses that are attempting to be developed around this. So I think for those of us who've been spending some years thinking about this, we're quite clear that it is not about data as property. Personal information is property, but it's about personal information as rights. And the second thing is also fascinating, because this project is among the first of its kind, where they are talking in India about innovation. So they say if you bring in law from the beginning, from the word go and even before the word go, they've known that there is a need for a law which has to govern anything that's going to take this kind of shape. They've known it forever. They've also known that privacy will be a concern, and it's acknowledged in all the documents. But they say we'll defer it for a later time. Why? Because they say innovation should not be stifled by law. Innovation should not be stifled by threats of liability. And they should be able to do what they want after they have created the product. They want the law to conform to the product, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
So here, we keep talking about relationships changing. People from being citizens became subjects when the state started demanding that if they ask, we should give. Never mind, why they are going, how they are going to use it, who they are going to give it to. The state has been telling us your job is to obey. We tell you to stand in a line, come give us your fingerprints, your iris. Just stand in a line and come and give this to us. If you raise any questions, we will cut you out of many things. So when they began, the state started with saying that, it is voluntary. If you want, you can take it. Then they said it's voluntary, but if you want to have A, B, C, D services, then you cannot get those services. For instance, you can't get your food, you can't get your work, you can't get your salaries. Although you've worked for it already and it's put into the bank, they won't put it into the bank till you attach your UID number to it. So they said it's voluntary. If you want, you can take it, but you won't get any of this unless you've already put the number. Then it goes on over a period of time till they've reached a point now where they say that if you don't link your UID number with your mobile phone, it's okay, but your mobile phone will be cut off, that's all. And then if you don't put your number with your bank account, then it's okay, it's not a problem if you don't do it, except that you can't operate your bank account after a certain time, which means that it will just get frozen. Right. And what is yours is no longer yours. Now, this is an extreme level of a vice grip that is being exercised, to force people to get onto the system. That's why I say it doesn't matter to them if biometrics doesn't work. It doesn't matter to them if you can't authenticate yourself. They just need that number in every database. And this is a huge corporate ambition. And it produces personal risk and national risk. If a whole population is going to be numbered like this and to be so visible to whoever is able to get their hands on it, it's not the people who get that information. It is whoever wants to use it on the people, right?
Right. Very true.
So, and on innovation, they say since we don't want any law and we don't want any liability, when you talk about your money being, losing money which is in your bank and then you think you can get it back, actually today you can't. Today when monies have gone missing in the pipeline, when it has been transferred virtually, and it has been by moving it from an account to a UID number account, and the money goes missing in the middle, there's no way of getting it back. Nobody is liable.
And is this the only instance? I mean, is India the only country where such a massive project has been taken up, trying to profile the individuals using their biometrics, or there is another precedent anywhere else in the world?
I mean, you know that America thought of the real ID, and then, fortunately in this country your federalism still works. So you find that different states took different positions, and we find that in 2010 when the biometrics report came out from the US through the NIST, you find that they recognized that biometrics is not a great route to go as a determinative thing, and it seems like it hasn't moved in the same way. In the UK they tried it. Tony Blair government did attempt it. They brought in a legislation, but the Conservatives, when they were when they were canvassing during elections, they made the promise that if they came in, they would strike this whole thing down, because like they said when after they in 2010 they came to power and they did in fact strike it down. There were a number of reasons. The London School of Economics had done a whole project called the Identity Project, and it helped the administration and many other people outside the administration too, to recognize the various pitfalls in a project of this kind, apart from cost and apart from its indeterminate kind of way, indeterminacy. Apart from that, there were a number of things. It's a whole report that was brought out. So they scrapped it in 2010, saying at that time that a project like this would be intrusive bullying, and that's not what they wanted to be doing. They didn't want the state to be citizens to be subservient to a state. There's a certain, there should be even governments that tend to make policies without full consultation end up thinking before they say that people should become subjects of the state again. People who understand history would not want this to happen. India was the first to, India had a huge advantage over other countries in that we had a government at that time, in 2009-10, we had a government that was very pro bringing in projects of this kind. What they wanted more than anything else was to reduce subsidy. Because, as you know, in a liberalized framework, they hate giving anything to the poor. And that the poor have been poor not because they chose to be poor, but because systems render them poor, of course, gets completely lost in a thing like this. So when it was sold to them saying that you can have a project which will help you reduce subsidy, they took it and they didn't ask any further questions. The problem with that government was that they went by cronyism, not even crony capitalism. It's a kind of cronyism. And Nandan Nilekani was allowed to come in and do what he wanted. And the state supported him through all of it. But when this government came in, you find that the ambitions around this project changed. And everybody now wants to use it as a mechanism for control. I don't think this kind of thing has happened in any other country so far. China tried introducing the biometric ID. Even China decided that maybe it was not a great idea. Partly, I would think, because such a database would make them vulnerable to their population being known to somebody else who can get into their database. These are national security risks.
Right.
So it's only a government that doesn't understand what it is doing which will continue to do a thing like this.
And there have also been various news articles on these, the security breaches that happened, which led to a lot of Aadhaar cards out in the open, Aadhaar numbers rather. And the UID AI chief came out saying that, hey, just if knowing Aadhaar number itself is no security concern, because you still need the one-time password, or you still need biometrics to authenticate yourself. Is that really true? I mean, there is no real danger if somebody knows someone else's Aadhaar number and they cannot misuse it?
Actually, it's quite interesting the way they've gone about this, because they start off with saying, when we say leak, where did it leak from? They asked that this number should be put into various databases that have a whole host of other information. So they say when you collected information for the UID to produce the number, they say, we take very minimal information. We don't take anything that has to do with either income or medical information or your religion or race or caste or whatever. And therefore, this is just, very minimal information. But they create other databases in different kinds of, in institutions, into which they insist that the UID number should be put. So you create the link. And then they leak out into the public. And every time there is a leak, there are two things that the UID says. One, but this did not go from our database, which actually makes no sense at all. Who cares where it went from? And for another thing, we know that the UID has never told us when their own database has been breached, as happened when the Tribune reporter found out that there were, backdoors to all of this, which had been created. And it was possible for them to get as much information as they wanted from the UID database itself. But they've always refused to acknowledge this. The second, the big, huge problem in this is that every time it has been shown that there is this problem, that it is leaking here, it's leaking there, and it's leaking everywhere, the UIDA is so busy protecting itself and not having, their interest has always been that no one should say anything negative about it. So they start harassing the person who revealed to them that such a leak had happened. So any time a person has shown the weakness in the system, that person has started getting harassed. So in the Tribune incident, for instance, the reporter was, had her name put into the first information report, which is the first, launching of a criminal case. That very soon we found that even before anything could happen on it, the editor had got eased out of his place. He's a very senior person, and he was eased out. And, all tales that have been told say that it had to do with the UID matter and the kind of protection that he was giving to the reporter, and that he had allowed this breach to be, spoken about in his paper. It had really created a splash. So the government was annoyed with it. There were various people annoyed, and so he was eased out. So it's a project that is unwilling to face the vulnerabilities that it is creating, and that makes it even more dangerous and risky.
So, I mean, I know the case is also being heard in the Supreme Court, and I think it's day 30 or day 31. I've lost count of it now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, given the concerns, the way you are putting it out, makes one feel that this is something not we should, walk into or not really sign up for. We should really understand the stakes here. Why is it that even the Supreme Court, has to prolong this hearing for like 30 days? Why can't it be simply seen as a matter of a security issue, right to privacy, which is, I believe, a fundamental right in our Constitution, and then, be subjected to that instead of trying to see if it can curb corruption or plug in the gaps in PDS and so on and so forth?
Actually, I'll just start with the last first. I mean, you were saying plugging the gaps in the PDS. That's the biggest bogey it's a complete...
I know.
It's complete nonsense, and I'm sure you've heard other people say it.
Right.
I'm not going to repeat that, except to say this, that, the using the poor as a means of pushing a project and making it appear as if it has some moral basis has been perhaps the worst thing that this, that the project authorities have done, because the poor are the biggest sufferers. And since it's happening far away from the eyes of those, of the people like us, it's not bothering anybody at all. And people have actually died because of that. So I think this that itself should tell us how serious this project is. But actually, the question that you asked, I would ask a different question. Because for me, I find when I'm watching the proceedings in the court that they are hurrying it through too much, and they really need to know all the implications before they can make a decision. Because when the case started in 2013, if they had heard it then, there would have been only so much to tell, because the experience was also limited. By 2018, not only do we have an experience with what the project itself is doing, we also know what it means to have a completely lawless state. And why do I say that? Because from the word go, first of all, they start on, with only executive notification, and they don't bring in a law. Then finally, after a lot of civil society pressure, they introduce a law in Parliament in 2010, December. And in 2011, December, the Parliamentary Standing Committee, to which it has been referred, rejects not just the law, the bill, but also the project, saying you can't carry on with this. They ignore that because it's only recommendatory. They decide not to take that recommendation. They don't bring back a law into Parliament at all till 2016, March, when they come in and they pass this whole thing, they road roller it. I mean, whatever, right. Steamroller the law through Parliament by not allowing the upper house of Parliament to even have a discussion. I mean, they have a discussion, but they have only that last day, because after that, if they don't conclude the discussion on that day, within the, Rajya Sabha would be, the term would be over for that time. The sitting was over. And on the 14th day, it will just come into effect, because it was treated as what is called a money bill, which it is not. By any definition, it is not a money bill. So, that was one whole level of unethical practices and illegal practices. Then the Supreme Court in 2013 said, listen, you cannot deny anyone a service because they don't have a UID number. That was ignored. In fact, soon after the court passed that order in September, in October, the UIDAI and two other agencies went back to the court to say, oh, please allow us to make it mandatory. That's the only way this project can work. The court did not accede. On the 26th of November, they heard them and said, no, the interim order shall continue. Yet, they said, okay, we asked you, if you gave us permission, we would have followed what you said. If you don't give us permission, we'll just pretend your order doesn't exist, and they've carried on with making it mandatory everywhere and on, in every service. And exclusions have started, threats have started. See, you tell me what it means when you have a bully state. And the government the court has had enough time to see that their own orders have been systematically and quite flagrantly violated. So by now, we can show each of these things. And then now we know what is happening with companies which have been involved, companies that are very close to the CIA, to the Homeland Security, to the French government, which are controlling and managing all our data. Biometrics, we don't even have the software or the technology for it, so we don't have the source code as a country. Source code is held by some company. And, there is so many things that have come up now that we feel that if the court were to give us that time and not listen to the petitioners like they just need to get past what they are saying, it would really help them understand what the depths of this project are. What has helped us, and I must confess that, as a person who studied this for the longest time, I was listening very carefully when the arguments for the government started and for the UID AI, because I said, it shouldn't be that I have been only looking at one side of the story. Maybe there is another side. And it was horrifying to find that there is not even one argument on the other side. There is nothing they can say to justify it. So, and the last thing that I heard before I left for this visit was one of the senior persons who was arguing for the UID AI, saying that this is about balancing interests. And he gave a completely bizarre illustration where he said, there are persons in manual scavenging, people belonging to the manual scavenging community. It is a traditional occupation for them, and they may choose that they want to be in this occupation. But the government may decide that, no, this is a violation of the right to life, and therefore we need to have a law that will prevent them from continuing with this. Now, the fact of the matter is that that it is the community of persons in manual scavenging who've been fighting for the enforcement of a law that somehow they brought into being in 1993. From 93 to 2003, the government did nothing. So finally, they went to court. In 2010, they had a national level yatra coming back to Delhi during the Commonwealth Games to tell the government that they need to put an end to this practice, and that in 2014, you had the Supreme Court pronounce. So it's their own court making a pronouncement that this whole thing is about untouchability and that you cannot continue with this practice. People are dying in sewer lines, and you have to end this practice. And this, the lawyer has a completely absurd argument to make that people choose to be in this profession, and so the state is coming in to save, persons of what was he even saying? That's when I realized he really has nothing to say, and that's why he's having to resort to this kind of absurdity, There was really nothing I could hear in their arguments which, you can't say that we have 13-foot high walls and 5-foot whatever walls which is producing. That's, now you know what our security is.
Yeah, no, I saw that as a response in one of the Lok Sabha Q&A answers. That the minister asked about the security, and this guy responds saying, we have this CRPF force stationed outside this huge database and whatnot. So now you know what it is. That's the reason I can't, sometimes I find it difficult to imagine that anybody can still think that this project is an okay project. Because it's shown itself up in hundreds of ways. So just because it is a project, it doesn't. And the other very interesting thing, the thing they're trying to do through this use of this project is to leave the working classes in the informal economy, but make every paisa that is made come into the formal economy. So they want control over the money and the movement of money, but they don't want to do with the people. So it's actually called, that part of it is called cashless, paperless, and presenceless. They are not interested in the presences. It's very different from what we think of as administration and for a state that cares for its people. That's a very interesting insight. I think, we don't actually go to the depth of what this, the implications of this mean, but this last statement that you made, the cashless, paperless, and presenceless, I think that's really something people need to, reconsider. So what is the way forward, Usha? I mean, I know you've been studying this for the longest time possible, and, maybe one of the very few who has done that. So are you still optimistic that, the Supreme Court or later on maybe the government will be forced to rethink the UID project?
I see that there are 2-3 different kinds of things. The one thing is what will happen with this project with, what will the court say? It is honestly difficult to anticipate what the court will say, but I can say this much, that when the hearing started, I think many of the judges on the bench had not seen that there could be much problem with this. They thought maybe they need to tweak it a little here and tweak it a little there. But after the UIDAI CEO had spoken, and if you watch them react and respond to the CEO, I think their perplexity deepened, because they thought that they would be getting answers to their questions, but what they got were more questions. So I think the court is not going to find it easy to just say that this project should carry on. The general tendency of courts is to say, if the government is doing something, let's not interfere with it. But I think this project has gone way beyond that, even to the limited extent that was possible to present it in a courtroom. Although we say 30 days, it's never been more than 3 hours a day, and many of those days it's not even been the full 3 hours. So they've not, what they've heard has, I think, befuddled them enough for them to know that they can't just think that it's okay. So that much I can say. Beyond that, it's difficult to anticipate a court. Also, you must have heard that there are all those complications that have come in with the 4 judges who spoke up and said that, and one of the cases that they referred to was in fact the Aadhaar case, saying that, you shouldn't, because there are other judges who've been on the earlier benches who'd passed the earlier orders, and none of them was put onto this bench. So there is some kind of questioning that's been going on around that. You may also have heard that there is an opposition move now for impeaching the current Chief Justice.
Right.
Now, how all this will impact on the case is very hard to tell. But I think it would be too naive to think that none of it will make any difference to what happens, to some of these major cases in the court. That's one side of it. But on the other side, we can see that it is already crumbling in many places. For instance, the fintech ambitions. Since 2016, they've been saying we don't want to use biometrics. Allow us to use some other two-factor authentication. So just like I said at the beginning, they want the number to be put into the databases, but they don't want to use biometrics as the identifier. So one part of it is already slowly becoming redundant, except where it's among the poor, where most people don't seem to care what happens to them. So when it comes to their own businesses, they're looking for something else. The third thing, I actually think that the way this project is going, in about 4 or 5 years' time, people are not, it's going to be difficult to produce a secure ID in India. Because everything that is personal, which can constitute a part of that ID, has become converged, and it has become too public. Every time the UID chief says, but the number is not, what is there? It's after all just a number. Then they say, after all, what is there? Your information about you is not secret, and therefore it doesn't matter if all of it is out, if your personal information is out. Then they link up your mobile number with it, they link up your bank account number with it, and they link up, they want it now to be on every database, so your school, your college, your marks, your this, your that, everything has got linked up to such an extent that to find some information about you which can produce that secure ID, I think it's going to be really difficult in a very short time. And I think we've just not thought it through. I think it's a product that got marketed brilliantly, but the product itself is deeply defective.
Right. That's a nice way to sort of, I think, end the conversation. But one last question. I know the answer, but I'll just ask anyways. Do you have Aadhaar?
No, I don't.
I'm actually doing my own survey. I've called about 35 MPs so far, and I've asked them if they had applied Aadhaar and if they linked to their mobile and bank account. And 13 actually responded. 7 of them said they do have Aadhaar. But none of them were confident when I asked them if they linked their mobile or if they linked their bank accounts. And, of course, there were a few MPs who were totally pissed that I was even asking them this question.
But you know what? I mean, I think the number of people having the number, having got enrolled, whatever that number, because, the extent of bullying that has gone on, and they bring you to a point where they say, you won't have cooking gas, you won't have your bank account, older people in the family who you have to take care of. All of this has pushed people to enroll. So a large number may have enrolled, but many of them, the largest number are feeling like they've been pushed and coerced into this. And many of them, therefore, have not used it beyond. And I know people who say, oh, well, they came to me in 2010. I didn't even know what it was. I just enrolled. I don't even know where it is. And I have no means of finding out either. I don't know what information I gave at that time. I was staying somewhere else. That's why I'm saying, there's in the TAG-UP report, there is one chapter 6, in which they have a passage where the UID AI is used as an example to say, how it's garbage in, garbage out. And therefore, to prevent that from just remaining garbage, what do you need to do? They call it a self-cleaning system. That is, you will need to use the ID, otherwise you are going to suffer, and therefore you will make whatever effort you can to make sure that you clean up the database for the UID AI. So the whole onus is on the person, on the individual, threatening them with exile from all systems, unless they manage to somehow clean up that system over which they have no control. This kind of a project, to call it an identity project would be, and it's not even an identity. To call it an identification project may be a little more accurate. But the one thing that it is not, it's not a verification project. So there is a name, there is some number, somebody might put in a biometric. You have, at no stage in this project do you verify who the person is. So we are essentially becoming, like we say, a country of, according to the project, we are of fakes, ghosts, and duplicates. And according to those who are watching the project, they say this is a country of unverified and increasingly unverifiable citizenry.
Well, thank you very much, Usha, for spending time with us and explaining the gory details of the identification project. Learned a lot about the privacy issues and the underlying insights, and hopefully listeners also do pay attention to how and when they want to use Aadhaar, if and when they do.
Right.
Right. Once again, thank you very much, Usha.
Pleasure is entirely mine. Thanks, Suresh.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.